What if the silence you gave someone became the loudest truth they ever had to face? What if the moment you stopped explaining, stopped correcting, and stopped reaching out was the moment they finally realized what your presence truly meant? You might think your absence goes unnoticed, but the human mind reacts to silence in a way that words can never compete with. Silence creates a vacuum, and the brain hates empty spaces. It tries to fill them, make sense of them, and understand what changed. And in that process, the person who once took you for granted starts seeing you with new eyes. Silence is not passive. It is not weak. It is not avoidance. Silence is power because it triggers the one thing every human struggles to sit with: uncertainty. When you stop contacting someone, especially someone who is used to your attention, their mind becomes restless. They replay old conversations, search for hidden clues, and wonder if they misread your loyalty. They may not say it out loud, but inside something shifts. They begin to feel the weight of everything they dismissed when you were still trying to communicate. There is a psychological effect that happens when someone who once cared becomes quiet. It disrupts the familiar pattern, and that disruption forces the other person to confront themselves. Without your words guiding them, without your efforts smoothing the distance, they have to face their own behavior. They start realizing that maybe they didn't give enough, didn't show enough, didn't value you enough. Silence turns into a mirror, reflecting every flaw they tried to ignore. This is why a man reacts so strongly when a woman stops contacting him. It's not the silence alone that unsettles him, it's the meaning behind it. He knows women don't disconnect emotionally unless they're deeply disappointed, deeply drained, or finally done. He knows silence isn't random, he knows it's intentional. And the moment he realizes that your silence is not a plea, not a tactic, not a test, but a decision, something inside him cracks open. Your silence forces him to feel what you once felt while trying to hold everything together. Your silence makes him aware of the effort he overlooked, the softness he took for granted, the consistency he never matched. It pulls him into an emotional territory he tried to avoid, responsibility. And this shift is powerful because it makes him reflect on what your presence brought to his life. Peace, attention, comfort, stability, things he never acknowledged while they were freely given. But here's the most important truth. Your silence is not about making him chase you. It's not about proving anything to him. It's about proving something to yourself. It is the moment you reclaim your emotional energy. It is the moment you stop pouring into someone who stopped noticing. It is the moment you step back, not out of fear, but out of self-respect. Stay with this message until the end, because what you are about to understand will change how you see your own worth. You are not losing anything by going silent. You are gaining clarity, power, and peace. And that shift will not only make him think about you more, it will make you think more deeply about yourself, your emotional value, and the kind of love you truly deserve. What you may not realize is that the moment your voice disappears from a man's world, something deeper than confusion begins to unfold inside him. It's not just the silence he feels, it's the sudden loss of the emotional imprint you left behind. Every woman carries a certain energy, and that energy doesn't vanish simply because the messages stop. It lingers in his mind, in his habits, in the small corners of his day where you once existed without him even noticing. When that presence is gone, the mind doesn't adjust instantly. It reaches back, searching for what it used to depend on. Men often appear calm on the surface, but internally they attach differently. They attach slower, more quietly, but in a way that sinks deeper than they show. And when that attachment is no longer fed, it doesn't fade, it intensifies. Silence becomes the trigger that wakes up everything he ignored while you were still giving. He starts replaying the way you spoke to him, the way you supported him, the way you made him feel understood without him having to explain himself. These impressions begin to echo louder because there is nothing new replacing them. In the space you left behind, your presence becomes amplified. The human mind is wired to value what it loses more than what it has. This is not theory, this is psychology. Loss activates attention. It sharpens awareness. It makes the smallest moment feel significant. And as time moves, instead of forgetting you, he starts noticing the exact qualities you carried: your patience, your consistency, your softness, your strength. He starts realizing how naturally you brought emotional warmth into his life without demanding anything in return. That realization doesn't hit all at once. It builds slowly, becoming heavier with every quiet day that passes. Silence creates emotional contrast. It forces him to compare what his life feels like without you to what it felt like when you were still there. And that contrast is powerful because it exposes everything he couldn't see when he was comfortable. Comfort blinds people. Distance wakes them up. And your silence becomes the moment he begins to see clearly, maybe for the first time. What he once treated as normal now feels rare. What he once assumed would always be there now feels fragile. What he once brushed off now feels meaningful. His mind doesn't run from these thoughts. It keeps returning to them because emotional imprints don't fade with distance. They intensify. He might try to distract himself. He might pretend it doesn't bother him. But the truth is that the human heart remembers who made it feel seen. And your absence reminds him of that truth every time he tries to ignore it. The real shift happens when he begins to understand that your silence is not empty. It carries the weight of everything you once offered but no longer give. And suddenly the emotional value you brought becomes clear in a way words never could. That clarity pulls him inward, forcing him to reflect, question, and feel. And as that reflection deepens, he starts to grasp the reality he couldn't see before. You were not just someone who talked to him. You were someone who impacted him, someone who added to him, someone who mattered more than he ever admitted. This is why your silence is powerful. This is why your absence speaks louder than any message you could send. And this is why staying committed to your emotional boundaries becomes the beginning of your personal strength, not the end of a connection. As that emotional imprint grows stronger inside him, something even more unsettling begins to take shape. The silence that once seemed insignificant now feels like a challenge to everything he believed about himself. When a woman who once cared stops reaching out, it doesn't just touch his emotions, it strikes his ego, and the ego is the most fragile part of any man, even the ones who pretend to be unbothered. Pride feeds on being wanted, being noticed, being chosen. When that feeling disappears, the ego starts to crack. The sudden withdrawal of your attention disrupts the narrative he built in his mind. He expected consistency, he expected effort, he expected your responses to come before he even had to think. When that stops, he's forced to face a reality he didn't prepare for. He is no longer the center of your emotional world. That realization hits harder than silence itself. It makes him question his own value, his own choices, his own behavior. And the more he tries to brush it off, the louder the discomfort grows. This is where obsession begins, not because he suddenly discovers new feelings, but because his ego can't understand why the attention he once took for granted is no longer available. He doesn't just miss you, he misses the power he held when he knew you would always show up. He misses the comfort of your reassurance. He misses the validation that came from your presence. And the absence of those things forces him into a mental loop he can't easily escape. The human mind hates losing control. When something slips away unexpectedly, the instinct is to chase, not physically, but mentally. He starts wondering what changed. He starts replaying moments that didn't matter to him before. He starts analyzing your silence like it's a puzzle he needs to solve. This internal pressure builds because he suddenly feels powerless in a dynamic where he used to feel in control. Your silence flips the emotional balance. And that shift exposes the truth about how much his ego relied on your attention to feel secure. What he didn't value when he had it becomes the very thing he craves once it's gone. And deep down, he knows your silence wasn't an accident. It was earned. It was shaped by his neglect, his distance, or his complacency. That awareness burns through his pride, forcing him to confront the reality he avoided. He pushed away someone who actually cared, and now he's stuck with the consequences. Every quiet hour becomes a reminder that he underestimated you. Every unanswered thought becomes a confrontation with his own behavior. Every emotional discomfort becomes proof that he was wrong about your dependence on him. And as these realizations surface, the ego transforms its fear into obsession, not because he is deeply in love, but because he cannot accept losing what once made him feel significant. But the deeper truth is this: your silence is not a weapon. It is a boundary. It is the point where you chose peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, and self-respect over desperation. And that choice forces him to look at himself in a way he never has before. Your silence exposes the gap between who he thought he was and who he actually is. It reveals the difference between comfort and connection. It shows him that attention is not guaranteed, affection is not owed, and your presence was never something he had the right to treat casually. This internal disruption becomes the catalyst for his obsession. It becomes the turning point where he feels the weight of everything he ignored. And in that weight, he begins to realize something he never expected. Losing your contact didn't just disturb his ego. It awakened his awareness of your worth. As that emotional imprint grows stronger inside him, something even more unsettling begins to take shape. The silence that once seemed insignificant now feels like a challenge to everything he believed about himself. When a woman who once cared stops reaching out, it doesn't just touch his emotions, it strikes his ego. And the ego is the most fragile part of any man, even the ones who pretend to be unbothered. Pride feeds on being wanted, being noticed, being chosen. When that feeling disappears, the ego starts to crack. The sudden withdrawal of your attention disrupts the narrative he built in his mind. He expected consistency. He expected effort. He expected your responses to come before he even had to think. When that stops, he's forced to face a reality he didn't prepare for. He is no longer the center of your emotional world. That realization hits harder than silence itself. It makes him question his own value, his own choices, his own behavior. And the more he tries to brush it off, the louder the discomfort grows. This is where obsession begins, not because he suddenly discovers new feelings, but because his ego can't understand why the attention he once took for granted is no longer available. He doesn't just miss you, he misses the power he held when he knew you would always show up. He misses the comfort of your reassurance. He misses the validation that came from your presence. And the absence of those things forces him into a mental loop he can't easily escape. The human mind hates losing control. When something slips away unexpectedly, the instinct is to chase, not physically, but mentally. He starts wondering what changed. He starts replaying moments that didn't matter to him before. He starts analyzing your silence like it's a puzzle he needs to solve. This internal pressure builds because he suddenly feels powerless in a dynamic where he used to feel in control. Your silence flips the emotional balance, and that shift exposes the truth about how much his ego relied on your attention to feel secure. What he didn't value when he had it becomes the very thing he craves once it's gone. And deep down, he knows your silence wasn't an accident. It was earned. It was shaped by his neglect, his distance, or his complacency. That awareness burns through his pride, forcing him to confront the reality he avoided. He pushed away someone who actually cared, and now he's stuck with the consequences. Every quiet hour becomes a reminder that he underestimated you. Every unanswered thought becomes a confrontation with his own behavior. Every emotional discomfort becomes proof that he was wrong about your dependence on him. And as these realizations surface, the ego transforms its fear into obsession. Not because he is deeply in love, but because he cannot accept losing what once made him feel significant. But the deeper truth is this. Your silence is not a weapon. It is a boundary. It is the point where you chose peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, and self-respect over desperation. And that choice forces him to look at himself in a way he never has before. Your silence exposes the gap between who he thought he was and who he actually is. It reveals the difference between comfort and connection. It shows him that attention is not guaranteed, affection is not owed, and your presence was never something he had the right to treat casually. This internal disruption becomes the catalyst for his obsession. It becomes the turning point where he feels the weight of everything he ignored. And in that weight, he begins to realize something he never expected. Losing your contact didn't just disturb his ego. It awakened his awareness of your worth. As that shift settles in, a quiet war begins inside him, a conflict he cannot hide from, no matter how calm he appears on the outside. When your presence fades and your attention disappears, he is forced into emotional territory he never wanted to explore. The first thing he feels is confusion, but it doesn't stay confusion for long. It turns into questioning, then regret, then a deep, uncomfortable awareness that he mishandled something he now wishes he had protected. This inner tension grows because silence doesn't just block communication. It exposes everything he tried to avoid within himself. Men are not taught to face their emotions directly. They push things down, they distract themselves, they pretend they don't care, but silence takes away the distractions. Silence removes the excuses. Silence sits with him when no one else is around. In that space, he begins confronting parts of himself he didn't want to acknowledge, the moments he ignored you, the effort he didn't give, the times he made you feel like your love was heavy instead of valuable. These truths don't disappear with time, they sharpen. He starts replaying the choices he made. He starts wondering why he didn't try harder. He starts realizing that maybe the distance you created wasn't sudden. It was the result of every moment he failed to show up. And the weight of this understanding begins to crush the ego that once made him so confident. It forces him to see that your silence is not an attack. It's a reflection of how he made you feel. For the first time, he sits with emotions he never let himself feel before, and they hit him harder than he expected. The conflict inside him becomes a battle between pride and truth. One part of him wants to believe you'll come back, that you still care, that your silence is temporary. But another part, deeper, quieter, more honest, knows he lost something important. He knows you pulled away because he didn't give you what you deserved. He knows the distance is the result of his own choices. That awareness hurts, but it also wakes him up. And while he's wrestling with these thoughts, something else begins to form, accountability. He starts seeing the moments when you were patient and he was careless. The times when you were consistent and he was distant. The times when you needed clarity and he gave confusion. This self-reflection builds pressure inside him because it exposes the gap between the man he believed himself to be and the man he actually showed you. That gap becomes impossible to ignore. The silence you created forces him into emotional honesty, and emotional honesty is the most uncomfortable growth a person can experience. It strips away excuses. It removes the shield of arrogance. It makes him see that relationships are not maintained by intention alone. They're maintained by effort, by presence, by consistency. And he can no longer pretend he gave those things. The more he reflects, the more he feels the urge to reach out. Not just to regain your attention, but to calm the storm inside his own mind. He wants to fix the discomfort that grows each day your silence continues. He wants to feel important again, valued again, chosen again. But beneath that urge lies something deeper, the beginning of emotional responsibility. Silence pushes him toward growth, whether he admits it or not. And in this internal conflict, one truth becomes undeniable. You didn't lose him when you stopped contacting him. He lost himself. He lost the version of himself he thought he was. And facing that loss becomes the first step toward understanding the worth he overlooked when he still had the chance. The deeper that conflict grows within him, the more he starts to realize that silence is not just distance. It is a revelation. It reveals who he becomes when comfort is removed. It reveals whether he chooses responsibility or avoidance. It reveals whether he shows up with sincerity or disappears behind pride. Silence becomes the test he never expected, the moment where his true character is exposed without him being able to hide behind words, excuses, or temporary effort. When your presence was there, he could mask his weaknesses. When your energy was available, he could pretend he was giving enough. But when everything you once offered is suddenly gone, he stands alone with nothing to lean on but the truth of who he really is. This phase forces him to face himself with a humility he never practiced. The absence of your voice makes his own thoughts louder. The absence of your attention makes his own actions impossible to ignore. If he valued you, he will feel pulled toward growth, drawn toward reflection, pushed into accountability. He will feel a desire to rise into a better version of himself because the silence exposes the gap between his intentions and his behavior. But if his connection to you was shallow, the silence will push him away, revealing his limitations, his immaturity, and his inability to rise to emotional responsibility. Either way, silence uncovers the truth. A man's reaction to being cut off is a mirror of his emotional depth. Some men crumble into anger because accountability terrifies them. Some retreat into denial because change demands courage they never developed. But the man who truly felt your value, even if he never said it, will be shaken awake by the quiet. He will feel the weight of what he lost, not through fear of being alone, but through recognition of what you brought into his life. He will notice the calm you offered, the clarity you gave, the emotional warmth that made him feel understood in a world that tells men to stay cold. When that warmth disappears, he feels the chill of his own emotional neglect. Your silence is not meant to destroy him. It is meant to protect you. It is a boundary that separates what you can no longer carry from what you are ready to embrace. It is the moment where your healing becomes louder than your hope. It is the moment where you refuse to shrink yourself to maintain a connection that doesn't nourish your spirit. That strength forces him to confront a question he never had to ask before. Who am I without the woman who cared for me? That question is powerful because it creates a shift in him that can't be undone. It becomes the point where he either steps forward with sincerity or fades into the background of his own excuses. It becomes the moment where he chooses whether to rise or remain small. Silence reveals whether he will fight for correctness or comfort, whether he will choose growth or pride, whether he will show up as a man or retreat as a boy. And while he stands in that crossroads, you begin to rise in a way you never did before. Your silence becomes the ground where your strength grows. Your distance becomes the boundary that restores your clarity. Your absence becomes the reminder that your value was never dependent on his recognition. The real lesson unfolds not just in how he responds, but in how you reclaim the space that was always yours. His reaction reveals his character, but your silence restores your power. When you reclaim that power, something extraordinary happens inside him, something he can neither control nor ignore. Your silence stops being just a lack of communication and becomes a measure of truth, a measure of who he is when he no longer has someone holding emotional space for him. It becomes the final indicator of his integrity, his maturity, and his capacity to genuinely care. A man's response to silence reveals more than his words ever could, because silence removes performance. It removes charm. It removes convenience. What's left is raw intent, and raw intent is impossible to disguise. He starts to feel the weight of every moment you carried the connection alone. He feels the distance you once felt. He experiences the uncertainty you once endured. And in that emotional shift, his character begins to surface. If he was careless, the silence exposes it. If he was inconsistent, the silence magnifies it. If he was genuine but afraid, the silence challenges him to choose courage over avoidance. Silence is not the end of communication. It is the beginning of revelation. As the quiet stretches on, he begins measuring himself not against what he wanted to be, but against what he actually showed you. That self-awareness is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. It forces him to acknowledge that you were never asking for too much. You were simply asking for honesty, presence, and effort. Things he should have offered freely. And now, as he sits with the absence of your energy, he recognizes that your silence is the most honest reflection of what he gave. This realization doesn't stay on the surface. It digs into him, making him see that connections are not maintained by expectation or assumption, but by intention. A man who truly values you will not be able to sit comfortably in the silence. He will feel pulled toward correction, clarity, and responsibility. He will feel the need to step up because the quiet makes him confront what he risks losing permanently. A man who is only attached to convenience, ego, or comfort will retreat into excuses. Silence separates the sincere from the shallow without you having to lift a finger. And while he's confronting himself, you are rising into a clearer version of your own identity. Silence gives you space to breathe, space to remember your worth, space to recognize that emotional peace is not something you should sacrifice for temporary attention. Your distance becomes the mirror that shows you how strong you truly are, because choosing silence is not a sign of giving up. It is a sign of growing up. It tells the world that you will no longer abandon yourself just to stay close to someone who refuses to grow. With every day that passes, you become more aligned with your own standards. You begin to understand that your love is not ordinary. Your presence is not ordinary. Your consistency, your emotional depth, your loyalty, none of it is common. And a man who cannot meet that energy is not someone you should chase. Silence teaches you that you deserve reciprocity, not excuses. You deserve effort, not intentions. You deserve accountability, not mixed signals. And as you grow into this awareness, he is left standing in the truth of who he became when you stopped carrying the weight for both of you. Some men rise when they realize what they've lost. Some men shrink. But his reaction is no longer your responsibility to manage. Your silence has already done the work. It has revealed who he is. And now it reveals who you are becoming. A woman who understands her worth so deeply that she no longer waits to be chosen by someone who only realized it after she walked away.